Okay. Welcome everyone to Journeys Through the Books of the Prophets. We are continuing with Shmuel Bet, the second book of Samuel. And we just finished the incident, we spent 2 weeks on it, of David and Bathsheba, one of the most complex, contentious stories about King David. And now we're moving to a different incident. We're on chapter 13 of Shmuel Bet. And this whole next section is actually one of the longest in the whole book of Shmuel Bet about the life of David. And that is the relationship between David and his son Avshalom. It lasts through chapter 20. We will see how far we get today, but we'll see that it's 7-8 chapters about the contentious relationship between David and his son Avshalom. And so chapter 13 begins by mentioning Avshalom, and then the story changes a little, but we'll see how involved Avshalom is. So chapter 13 begins with the son of David, Avshalom. And we have to remember, David had many wives and children from different wives. So there were a lot of half-brothers and half-sisters. So it begins by saying Avshalom had a sister, and her name was Tamar. And then it kind of switches to another son of David, whose name was Amnon. And here it says that Amnon had we'll call it a crush on Tamar, even though she was a half-sister. Already we can see the complication here. And apparently the text says he was, we'll call it love sick, but not in a healthy way. This is his half-sister. And he's actually forbidden to her. Nonetheless, we don't know his age exactly, but we can imagine that he's younger with perhaps raging hormones, and he's quite literally lovesick, but not in a healthy way. And so his cousin, whose name was Yonadav, who was the son of one of David's brothers, some advice. Now, we have to assume that Yonadav does not know how the story is going to play itself out. We'll give him what's called chafs. We'll give him the benefit of the doubt that Amnon and Tamar had virtually no relation, no connections. She was a virgin, and so we assume it's not like they weren't like in contact with each other all that much. So Yonadav says, why don't you like cook up a plot and like feign that you're really sick and ask your father, David, if he could send Tamar to make him some food. He's really, really sick, and he needs some help. David does not suspect anything, and so he sends Tamar. This was Yonadab's suggestion. Again, it's not clear at all that he was suggesting what Amnon ends up doing. Anyways, Amnon does this. He feigns being really sick. And so David sends Tamar, and she makes food for him and whatever. Then Amnon sends all of his servants, he's the prince. He sends all of the servants away. And then he says, come sleep with me. And she, of course, is a guest. And says, no, this is not proper. He forces himself on her and he rapes her. And then what's so interesting, right after it says, then he hated her even more than he supposedly loved her. So this is so classic. This is like a classic example of emotions gone completely awry. Now, in Pirkei Avot, they discuss this. Pirkei Avot is chapters of the fathers. In the 5th chapter, the 19th Mishnah, it says like this: Kol ahava shehi tluya b'davar, batel davar batela ahava. So it says, any situation of love that is contingent on something, if you take that something away, then you take away the love. And then it says, but if you have a love relationship which is not dependent on anything, not sex, not money, not power, not family, it's true love, not dependent on anything, it will never be nullified. So then the Mishnah says, well, can you give us an example of what you're talking about? So it says, what is the example of a type of love that is dependent on something? And they gives it the answer. Zu ahavat Amnon v'Tamar. This is the so-called love that Amnon thought that he had for Tamar. And what's the example of a love that is not dependent on anything? Zu ahava David v'Yehonatan. This is the love between David and Yehonatan, which we discussed at length in a previous chapter. So here, see, it's interesting that both of these examples have to do with the book that we're studying, Shmuel Bet, or Aleph and Bet. And so here, Amnon, obviously his hormones, his emotions, his intellect, completely skewed. He ended up raping his sister, his half-sister. And then he sends her away in disgrace. He calls his servants and says, it's a horrible story. It's a horrible story. She is devastated. Avshalom hears about this. This is his sister. Avshalom hears about this. And then we see two that are obviously unrectified. So he says to her, more or less, don't say anything. He is your brother. Like the situation is bad enough, but let's kind of hide this. So don't say anything. And then it says that Avshalom, he spoke with Amnon as if nothing had happened. But it says that in his heart, he hated Amnon, but he didn't say anything. He pretended nothing happened. The text continues. Word gets back to David of what happened, even though they had made an attempt to hide it. And David is outraged. But David doesn't do anything. So here we see Avshalom doesn't do anything. Amnon does. David doesn't do anything. And Tamar, all it says is she stayed in Avshalom's house, and she was devastated. Now, if we take into modern terms, until 25, 30, 40 years ago, this situation probably would be played out universally. And it is still played out universally. There are certain countries where, and I'm not going to mention them, but rapes occur like every 2 minutes or something. Every 3 minutes, there's a rape in certain countries. In every case, the people involved are never caught. Certainly in the Western world, and also here in Israel, things change dramatically. Where it used to be like so embarrassing, you don't want word to get out, and it, under the rug. That has changed dramatically, where victims now come forward, sometimes immediately, and sometimes it takes actually a number of years. And that's why sometimes you read a certain person is accused of rape or forced non-consensual sexual relations, and someone does come forward, and then 8, 10 other people come forward from a year ago, 5 years ago, 10 years ago, I'm only mentioning this because here we have a situation where Avshalom, it's clear, kills Amnon, but immediately he acts like nothing happened. It doesn't even say he was outraged, but then it says that he hated Amnon in his heart, and it took a number of years, but he did go ahead and learn it. He did kill Amnon, or have Amnon killed. And David, this was, you have to say, it was a major mistake of David, is that he doesn't do anything. Now we have to put this into context. And the context is, and this is not, in a certain way, not to defend David, but to try to understand the bigger context, is after the whole incident with Bathsheba. So God comes to the prophet Nathan and says, go to David and tell him that you have sinned, and the consequences will be that the child that at that point Bathsheba was carrying, he will die. The sword will be ever present in your generations that come from you, and you will be taken publicly, and they will be taken without their permission. And God says, you did what you did in private, but when wives are taken, it will be public. So it's happened. David probably, this is one of the consequences of what I did. This is what the consequences we were told. Even though God forgave David, we see an important general principle here is that even when God forgives, it doesn't mean always that the consequences are taken away. In other words, if God forbids a crime, it could be without even listing what kind of crime. And the person does true tshuva. And God accepts the tshuva because God told David that your tshuva is accepted. But the consequence, if someone kills someone else, that person can't be brought back. A person could do tshuva for it, tshuva, but the consequences sometimes can't be reversed. Sometimes they can. Someone steals. And part of their tshuva is they admit it and they return the money. And in some cases, they could even befriend the person that they stole from. The person forgives them. But sometimes the consequences have to play themselves out. So again, this is not an excuse for David, but he's also a father. And here he allows one of his sons to rape one of his daughters, and he doesn't say anything. So this begins, in a certain way, all of the events that will happen in the next 7 or so chapters. So, as I said, it does say that Avshalom hated Amnon for what he had done to his sister. And then what happened is 2 years go by. 2 years go by, and Avshalom is going to make a whole ceremony with shearing his sheep. So this was like a big thing. And so he comes to his father, the king, and he says, I'm inviting you and all of my brothers to come and be part of this ceremony that I'm doing. And it was somewhat clear to him that his father was not going to go. It wasn't like that major of an event. And David said to him, no, I can't go. And I'm not comfortable with everyone else going as well. And Avshalom kind of pressed David. And in the end, David agreed. This is only 2 years afterwards, and including that Amnon would be one of the people who would go. Because remember, Avshalom, on the surface, he, in a certain way, pretended that nothing happened. So all of the sons of David go to this, and when they get there, so Avshalom says to his servants, go and kill Amnon. So Avshalom himself did not kill Amnon, but his servants killed Amnon. And the same, and then what happened is that everyone, all of the king's sons saw this or heard about it, and they all fled. The word got back to David that Avshalom has killed all of his brothers. And so David is like, oh my God, what has happened here? And then Yonadav, this is the same Yonadav who gave Amnon the idea of how to invite Tamar in the first place. So he comes and he says, no, it's not true. Only Amnon has been killed. And so what happens at this point is Avshalom flees, and he is gone for 3 years. So remember, 2 years have passed since Amnon raped Tamar. And now Avshalom flees for 3 years. And now David has to deal with Amnon being killed. And so after 3 years, he comes to accept that he sees that in a certain way justice has been served here. And he accepts that Amnon is dead, and he's missing Avshalom. Avshalom is his son. He somewhat understands why Avshalom had Amnon killed, but he's still quite upset that Avshalom did this without permission. And so what happens here, it says that David longed to see Avshalom, but another part of it was, I just can't take him back so quickly. So Yoav, we have learned a little bit about Yoav. And later, I'm going to delve into who this person Yoav. Yoav is David's major general. He's the general of the army. But not only that, Yoav, in his own way, is a very, very powerful person. And we saw this, and I'm just going to mention this, but later we're going to go into a much deeper analysis of the relationship between David and Yoav. But the one place that we saw Yoav, other than Yoav going out to battle and fighting wars and being very successful, but back when David first becomes king of Yehuda, hopefully everyone will remember that Ishbosheth, the son of Shaul, he became king of the rest of Israel. David is only king of Yehuda. And then Avner, the general of Ishbosheth, he decides he's going to, in a certain way, leave Ishbosheth and join forces with David. So he comes to David and he says, I see that you're meant to be king over all of Israel. Right now we have like 2 kings over Israel. And I've kind of had it with Ishbosheth. He's not the right person. I'm going to throw my support to you. Now, Avner was the general of Shaul. He was the general of the son of Shaul. Now he is changing allegiance. And so David is very happy. He accepts Avner at his word. And he says, okay, let's kind of make an alliance, and I will rule over all of Israel. And so Avner is now leaving to put this whole plan in motion. And Yoav comes and he kills Avner. And he kills Avner. We learned all of this. Not everyone was at every class. Avner had killed Yoav's brother in battle. Wasn't like it was in battle. The forces of David were fighting against the forces of Ishbosheth. But Yoav blamed Avner that he didn't have to kill his brother. But we'll return to this story. So I'm only mentioning this because here we see Yoav does a very interesting thing. This is the beginning of chapter 14. Yoav comes up with a plan. And the plan is he sees that David, and the beginning of chapter 14 is V'yeda Yoav ben Tzuria ki lev hamelech al Avshalom. Yoav saw that the king's heart was towards Avshalom. There's actually a difference of opinion among the commentaries. Some say, what does it mean? His heart was towards Avshalom. The majority opinion means that he really wanted to bring Avshalom back and make peace with him and kind of end this whole incident. The others say is that Yoav saw that was true, but there was still a part of David that could not make peace with Avshalom. So Yoav comes up with a plan. He goes to what the text calls a wise woman of Tekoa. Tekoa is the name of a place. And I just want to mention that this has come up a number of times, all the way back to Yoshua, Shoftim, Shmuel. So many names of places are mentioned. And as discussed, some of the places are in more or less the very place today. Other places are not. In other words, again, we discussed all of this. Some places in Israel named a certain name that appears in these books, but it's not a claim that this is where the original was. But it seems like Tekoa, there is a settlement today called Tekoa. It's near Efrat. Many people know of Efrat because so many Americans have settled in Efrat. It's in what's called Gush Etzion, and it's near Bethlehem. And apparently the Tekoa today, I have a number of very good friends who live in Tekoa, and I've spent a number of Shabbats in Tekoa teaching and being with friends. And it is more or less in the same place as the ancient Tekoa. So Yoav's plan is he finds this wise woman in Tekoa, which already is interesting, that obviously there was a reputation about this woman, that she was considered very, very wise. And he chose Tekoa because it was a place that probably David wasn't that familiar with all of the people. And the plot is this woman is going to come with a fabricated story that below the surface is going to be hinting to David that he should bring Avshalom back and make peace with him. And so the story is that she comes and asks to have an audience with the king. And here I have to point out something very interesting. The question is, she came to the king for a judgment. And the question is, why did she come to the king and not to the court? And so here we see a very important thing, that in those days, in many instances, the courts ruled as they should. The Sanhedrin ruled. But the king also was considered a judge. And we see this, of course, with his son Solomon, Shlomo. And in fact, it's one of the famous stories of Shlomo that we will get to eventually, of one of his judgments. But the question is, why are judgments coming to the king? I thought that's supposed to go to the court. But the king had a dual position as king, but also in certain cases he could judge. So that is just explaining why this Yoav is coming up with this whole plot that this woman is going to come to the king asking for a judgment. So what's the story she comes with? She comes and says, my husband has died, and I have two sons. And they were out in the field, and there was no one there, and they got in a fight, and one of them died, implying that one of them killed the other, but not clear that it was like on purpose. It just, no witnesses, no warning. They were in a disagreement, and one of the sons died. So what her problem is, her husband is dead, and she only has this one son left. And the other members of the family are saying, this son should be brought and charged with murder. And she is coming to ask the king, please don't let this happen, because if that happens, there'll be no one to inherit my husband. There'll be nothing left of his name. And she's alluding to the fact that he didn't do it on purpose. And so David is like kind of falling for this. And first he says, okay, I'll look into this. But she presses him and says, please don't just look into this. Make a judgment that my son, he can come home and we can, and he won't be killed by his other relatives. Make a judgment. And so finally, he said, okay, I'll make sure nothing happens to your son. And then she changes her tone and she begins to hint to him that she's really talking about him. Now, this is very similar to another incident that we learned just recently, is after David, the whole incident with Bathsheba. So then Natan comes, the prophet Natan comes with really a parable, but David doesn't know it's a parable. This is of the rich man and he had like a tenant who was a very poor man who only had one sheep. And a guest came to the rich man, and instead of taking from his own sheep, which he had plenty, he took the one sheep from the poor man. And David is outraged and said, this person should be executed. And then Natan says, you are the person. It was a whole parable to show David that he, in a sense, took the lamb is Bathsheba, who's the wife of Uriah. David has many wives. He's like the rich man. And yet he ended up taking the wife of Uriah. That we discussed. It's not as simple as that. That we're not going to go back. Anyone who missed those classes, you can watch them on YouTube, go to the website, go to the Telegram, go to the WhatsApp, and you can see those classes. But here again, David is being kind of served up a parable. And so he finally figures it out. And he says, did Yoav put you up to this? And she admitted it. She said, yes, Yoav put me up to this. And the moral of the story is bring Avshalom home. In other words, that if Avshalom is forever in exile, that's not how the story should end. And in the story, though, what's interesting, there's two hints to that connect this to how Cain killed Abel. Because in the story of Cain and Abel, it says they were out in the field. There was no one there. It says that they talked to each other, and Cain rose up and killed Abel. There's even a commentary, a supposition that Cain didn't mean to kill Abel. No one had ever killed anyone. So it's not 100% clear that it was premeditated murder. That there's a possibility that Cain killing Abel was not necessarily on purpose. And it's not even clear that Cain understood that he could actually kill someone by hitting him. Others hold that no, he was really upset at Abel for a number of reasons, and he did kill him. But here, the story that she tells is like two sons were in the field. There was no one there. They got in a fight, kind of intimating that this is somewhat like the story of Cain and Abel. And then she also says that if my remaining son is brought to justice or is killed by my other relatives, then she said there'll be nothing remaining upon the face of the earth. And that same phrase is used when Cain is told what the consequences of him killing Abel will be. So he says, my punishment is more than I can bear, that I'll be like an exile upon the face of the earth, that I'll have no place where I will be safe or I can be grounded. It's the same term. And so what is the connection in this parable? Well, the connection is that Cain is punished, but God does not have him killed. Later in the Torah, it says if a person kills purposely, premeditatively, then their punishment is capital punishment. They need to be killed by the court. Capital punishment. But here we see Cain didn't have capital punishment. He had a consequences. He had a punishment. And so that is what she's hinting to about Avshalom. That Avshalom himself didn't kill him, that Amnon deserved it, and it's time to bring Avshalom back. And so right after this whole story, so David calls for Yoav and says, bring Avshalom home. And that is what happens. And Avshalom and Yoav, it says he bowed to the ground and he thanked the king. Obviously, Yoav went out on a limb here, because once the woman admitted, yeah, Yoav put me up to this, David could have been extremely upset, embarrassed, feeling that Yoav was acting behind his back, but he didn't act like that. He understood that Yoav was doing what he felt was best even for David and the kingdom. Again, each of these parts that have to do with Yoav, we will go into a more detailed assessment. But I'm waiting for another few incidences to play themselves out. So here we are in chapter 14. And so Avshalom comes back to Yerushalayim. He brings him back, but then it's complicated. The king won't see him. So in other words, we see that even after all of this, David's heart is torn how to deal with Avshalom. There's no doubt the text says he loved Avshalom. And we're going to see to what degree he loved Avshalom. But on the other hand, he was still upset. He was still upset with what Avshalom had done. And so I just want to go back, though, as part of this parable that the woman tells David, because it's a verse that is, over the generations, it's picked up by different commentaries. And what she says is, this is in the 15th verse of the 14th verse of the 14th chapter. And so she says to them, V'lo yisa Elokim nefesh v'chashav machshavot lebilti yidach mimenu nidach. That in trying to convince David that even God doesn't want her remaining son to die, so she says that God always figures out a way. Neither does God take away life, but devises means that none of us be banished forever. Lebilti yidach mimenu nidach. And so, especially, I'm just remembering that the Slonim Rebbe in Netivat Shalom, he brings this verse all the time. This idea that no one is too far away that they can't return to God. That God's desire is that no one should be left behind. No one should be banished. And so this verse from the parable that the wise woman of Tekoa is telling David is used by many, many commentaries to, we'll call it, promote the idea of tshuva. That this is what God's desire is to always try to leave the door open that no one will be left behind. No one is left behind. And that's why we have this idea. We know that if a letter is missing in the Torah, or is even written in a way that is not correct, the whole Sefer Torah cannot be read in public until it's fixed. If even one letter is like missing or is broken. And so commentaries throughout the ages have mentioned, just like there's 600,000 letters in the Torah, there's 600,000 root souls in Israel. And just like if one letter is missing in the Torah, if one root soul in Israel is missing, then all of Am Yisrael in a certain way is not complete. And this teaching is repeated by many, many different rabbis, different commentators, this idea that no one can be left behind. No one is too far away that they can't do tshuva, and God will accept it. Again, the consequences may not be able to be reversed, but it doesn't mean that a person can't Shuva. Okay, so back to Avshalom is now back in Yerushalayim, but the text says he didn't have permission to come see the king. And then it mentions something very interesting. This is in the 25th verse of the 14th chapter. And it says that in all of Israel, there wasn't anyone who is so praised for their beauty. Apparently, Absalom was very handsome, very charismatic, and especially his hair. And it's just interesting here that they say that he used to cut his hair at the end of every year because his hair would grow so much in the year that it would like weigh him down. And so he would cut his hair every year, but it would grow back. And in a certain way, he became famous for his hair. That was part of his beauty, his being handsome. And it mentions it here. And then it says that Avshalom was 2 years in Yerushalayim, and he didn't see his father, the king. So he sent for Yoav. Now remember, Yoav is the one who managed to get David to bring Avshalom back to Yerushalayim. So Avshalom sends for Yoav, wanting him to come and convince David to let him come see the king. In a certain way, Avshalom also loved his father. But we see what's going to develop in Avshalom is a deep love-hate relationship. And what's very interesting here is this is exactly what happened to Amnon. Amnon supposedly loved Tamar, but as soon as he raped her, obviously he understood that, what have I done? But instead he put it on her. And it says he hated her even more than he loved her. So again, this is very twisted, that his love turned to hate. But then there's what's called the love-hate relationship. There was no more love. That's what we learned in Pirkei Avot. As soon as what his love was dependent on is taken away, then there is no love. But then you have a kind of relationship called a love-hate relationship, where it's both simultaneously. And of course, this is not exclusive to Absalom here. Or here we see that David never hated Absalom, but he just didn't know how to deal with him. How do you deal with what had happened here? But we see that Absalom, his love, because it wasn't returned, at least in his mind, it got twisted to a type of hate, which we'll see is what led to the rebellion of Absalom. And so Absalom calls for Yoav, but Yoav doesn't go. Some say it's because I did enough here. I can't get more involved between you and your father. So Absalom called for him again, and Yoav didn't come. Now, again, we have to understand, Absalom is a prince. He is the son of the king. Maybe he's going to be the future king. Not clear. Yoav is a general in the army. But again, as we're going to see, Yoav is a very enigmatic very forceful person. So Yoav doesn't go. So what does Absalom do? He calls his servants and he says, my fields are next to Yoav's. Obviously, Absalom had some fields that were in his possession or in his domain. And Yoav had fields right next to him. So Absalom said to his servants, go burn down his fields. And that's what they do. They go burn down Yoav's fields. Obviously, that catches Yoav's attention. He understands that Absalom is behind this. So he goes to him and says, why did you burn down my fields? Absalom said, why didn't you come when I called for you twice? So here's like a real power struggle, And he says to him, why did you bring me back from exile? Here I'm in exile in Jerusalem. I would have been better off staying where I was. So Yoav realizes, I have to get involved here. So he goes to the king and he convinces the king enough is enough. And we'll see there are other times where Yoav, he speaks up to the king. He's not afraid of David. We're going to see he has tremendous loyalty, but it's not clear what's motivating it. Anyways, he comes to David and says, enough, like, let Absalom come, make up with him already. And so David listens to him. And it says that Absalom came and he bowed to the ground in respect. And it says that David kissed Absalom. Now we assume that they discussed things, but the text doesn't tell us what actually happened. But they met face to face. Absalom shows his respect, and David kisses Absalom, obviously as a sign that, okay, let's end whatever happened between us. And so what is interesting, and we'll probably just stop here, is right after this, Absalom rebels against David and claims the kingship for himself. And this is the beginning of chapter 15. And this is going to play itself out for 5 chapters, the rebellion of Absalom, and how David had to flee Jerusalem, and all of the consequences. It wasn't just a little family feud. Absalom, and we'll see, he plotted his rebellion until he felt that he had actually, the words here, he stole the hearts of all of Israel. And that we'll have to get into. But I think this is a good place to start, because once we start, it's better that we start from the beginning of the rebellion. So we did chapters 13 and 14, and we will continue. I do want to mention at this point that for everyone who's watching now and everyone who will be watching, that it's not clear if there'll be a class next Sunday, because next Sunday is Tisha B'Av. And so if first of all, you can't learn Torah on Tisha B'Av other than things that are connected to the destruction of the temple. So we would not be learning Shmuel Bet. The question is, it would be 6 o'clock here, which is towards the end of the fast. For most of the people watching, it's at 11 o'clock on the Eastern Coast. Some of you, it's even earlier. And many of you may be in synagogue or fasting. So everyone, as always, there is a chance that I will teach a class about Tisha B'Av, but I haven't decided yet. I haven't decided if that's a wise decision. So everyone, as always, look at your emails, look at your WhatsApp, and it will be very clear what will happen next Sunday. Welcome everyone to Insights into the weekly Haftarah. This coming Shabbat is Parshat Devarim, and as we've discussed, between the fast day of Yud Zayin B'Tammuz and Tisha B'Av, the 3 Shabbats, there will always be 3 Shabbats. There are 3 special Haftarot that do not relate to the Parsha of the week, as in the rest of the year, but relate to something connected to the destruction of the temple. So this week, we have the third of the 3 Haftarot that have to do with the destruction of the temple. This Haftarah it's a very, very special Haftarah for many different reasons. First of all, in the course of the year, there are a number of Shabbatot that have special names. Most Shabbat is just Shabbat, but there's certain Shabbats during the year that have special names. And not that many, really a handful, but many of them have to do with what the Haftarah is, not what the Parsha is. Some do. This is one of them, that this Shabbat is called Shabbat Chazon. Chazon means vision. Why is it called Parshat Chazon? Is because this Haftarah comes from the very beginning of the book of Isaiah, of Yeshayahu, right? The first verse. And it begins, Chazon Yeshayahu, the vision of Yeshayahu, that of course he is sharing with all of Israel, the vision that he has that is revealed to him by God. And so this Shabbat is called Shabbat Chazon. What's interesting is the week after Tisha B'Av also is called, after the Haftarah, it's called Shabbat Nachamu. Nachamu means console. And this is also a Haftarah from Yeshayahu. So here we'll mention something very, very important that, and I think I mentioned this in last week's recording of the Haftarah, that there are 3 special Haftarot between the 2 fast days during the 3 weeks. But then between Tisha B'Av and Rosh Hashanah, there are 7 special Haftarot, again, that do not have to do with the weekly Torah portion. This is an exception. They're really 10. There's 3 that are during the 3 weeks, and then there's 7, and they're all called Haftarot of consolation. And they all come from Isaiah. And so this week's Haftarah is very special because this is the beginning, the opening chapter of the book of Isaiah. Now, it's explained that of all the prophets of Israel, other than Moshe, there was no prophet like Moshe. He's in a category of his own. He speaks to God face to face, mouth to mouth, peh el peh, panim panim, and he sees his prophecy is true. What's called asplaklaria hamira, a clear pain. He sees clearly what God is saying. All the other prophets saw through what's called a somewhat cloudy pain, aspaklaria lo meira. But the prophet that is considered the greatest prophet other than Moshe is Isaiah. And one of the reasons is that's why the 7 haftarot of consolation are all from Isaiah. Now, many other the prophets gave incredibly beautiful words of consolation, but none as many as Isaiah. So here we see the beginning of the book of Isaiah, and it begins with the word chazon, the vision of Isaiah. Before we look at the Haftorah, one other thing, a very, very well-known teaching from Rabbi Levi Yitzchak of Berdichev. Levi Yitzchak of Berdichev, a very, very famous Hasidic Rebbe in the beginning of the 1800s. He was known as the great defender of Israel. There are many, many, many stories of how he found ways to defend the Jewish people before God, and always prayed and tried to convince God to see how special the Jewish people were and how they deserved his compassion. And so one of the famous Torahs from Levi Yitzchak of Berdichev is that on this Shabbat, this coming up Shabbat Chazon, everyone can have a vision of the third temple. This is a statement by Levi Yitzchak of Berdichev, is that it's not just that Yeshayahu has a vision. Now here in the vision of this Haftarah, he doesn't talk about the third temple. He warns them about the destruction of the temple that will happen if they don't change their ways. But nonetheless, Levi Yitzchak Berdichev says that on this Shabbat, everyone can have a vision of the third temple. So what does that mean exactly? One way of understanding is just simply, we have a tradition that Mashiach is born on Tisha B'Av. This is one of the main understandings of Tisha B'Av. In the depths of tragedy, the tragedies of Jewish history, there will always be the seed of redemption and the ultimate redemption of the coming of Mashiach. So here in this vision of Yeshayahu, it begins with very, very harsh condemnation of the level that the Jewish people have fallen to. And again, he's a conduit for God's words to the people, but he ends it in consolation. So I think what Rabbi Levi Yitzchak of Berdichev was trying to say is, here when you read this Haftarah, we can understand why the temple was destroyed. We can understand how far the people had strayed from a closeness to God and the Torah, and the moral and ethical falling of the Jewish people. But it ends with consolation. And so I think what Levi Yitzchak of Berdichev was saying, this vision of the third temple means a vision of redemption, a vision of Mashiach of the third temple. And so in the preparation for Tisha B'Av, so we see that there is always hope. So let's look very, very quickly through what Yeshayahu says here. And he begins by saying, in the name of God, he says, children have I raised and exalted, but they have rebelled against me. An ox knows his owner, and a donkey his master's trough. Israel does not know, my people does not perceive. In other words, an ox and a donkey, they know who their master is. The Jewish people have lost all perspective of who God is and their relationship to God. He goes on and he compares them to Sodom and Amorah. Sodom and Amorah, back in the book of Genesis, these were the most evil people that God wiped out. Here, God is saying, you have become like the people of Sodom and Amorah. And it wasn't just that they had turned away from God, they had turned away from morals and ethics. That was even as important. And then God says, and this is continued by some of the other prophets, God says, I hate your sacrifices. By the way, I think someone has some kind of device on that's making a sound here. It might be coming from me, but if it's someone else, please turn it off. But it could be coming from me. Anyways, God says, I can't stand your sacrifices. They're so insincere. They're so hypocritical. I can't stand them anymore. The language is very, very harsh here. And then the tone changes dramatically. And God says, let us reason together, says Hashem. If your sins will be like scarlet, they will whiten like snow. If they have reddened like crimson, they will become as wool. If you will be willing to obey, you shall eat the goodness of the land. But if you refuse and rebel, you shall be devoured by the sword. This is the choice that God is telling the people. Please change your ways. And it ends, and then in the 21st verse, Isaiah uses the word Eicha Haita Lezona, Kirya Nemana. How could it be that this city of faith, meaning Jerusalem, has become like a prostitute? Now, this is one of the reasons why this Haftorah was chosen, is because of the word Eicha. How could it be? That is the first word of the book of Lamentations, Eicha, which is called in Hebrew Eicha, that we read on Tisha B'Av. So this is really one of the primary reasons this particular warning was chosen as the Haftorah. Because just like Isaiah is saying in God's name, how could you have fallen so low? How did it happen? Eicha. Well, this word is how we begin the book of Lamentations on Tisha B'Av as we're sitting on the ground. What's also interesting is in the Parsha of Devarim, Moshe says Eicha. Moshe also says the word Eicha. How could it happen? And in the Garden of Eden, after they ate from the tree, God, when they're trying to hide in the garden, God says, Ayeka, where are you? What have you done? Ayeka is Echa, just pronounced a little bit differently. So here you see 4 different Echas. The Echa of the Garden of Eden, the Echa that Isaiah is saying here about the city of Jerusalem. How could it be that the city that has the temple in it, a city of faith, has become like a prostitute? And the book of Lamentations begins, how could it be that the people have fallen to such level? And in the Parsha, also, Moshe uses the word Echa. But how does it end? It ends that God says, that I will return my hand upon you and refine you with lye, your dross, and I will remove all of your base metal. In other words, through however you want to say it, the consequences of your actions, Israel, the punishments, the exile that you brought upon yourself, it's like you're being purified from the dross. And then God says, then I will return your judges as in earlier times, and your counselors as at first. After that, you shall be called the city of righteousness, a faithful city. Zion shall be redeemed with justice, and her returnees with righteousness. That's how the Haftarah ends. Almost every Haftarah of warning ends on a positive note. So here, again, we see the same dynamic, that all the words of the prophets did not have to occur. And they made it very clear. In God's name is, if you don't change your ways, these will be the harsh consequences. A measure for a measure. But if you change your ways, you'll have nothing but good. Now, what's significant is that these words are employed in the Shemona Esrei, in the Amidah. It's one of our requests is to return us judges as in previous years. And ultimately, we're asking God, you be our ultimate judge. And it comes to these very words, where it says, "V'ashiva shavtayich kirishona, v'yoetzacha kebatchila." And your advisors, I will return your judges as in the beginning, and your advisors as well. So here, Bezrat Hashem, today we could listen to these words. We could all do the type of personal tshuva that we need to do, that the Jewish people as a people could do the tshuva that we need to do. And it would turn our current situation around completely. May this Tisha B'Av be a turning around, and we can turn a day of fast into a day of celebration.